Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, July 17th, 2018. I have not been indicted so far this morning, and so it's time to go ahead with another show. It's Tuesday, and no help is scheduled. Well, you know what? I found out yesterday that this show is a physical ordeal. I don't know if you had guessed that was the case, but I had no idea to what extent it required constant training. It's been a long time since I had an extended period of time away from the microphone that didn't involve at least some, not only pre-recording, but work during the break to try to keep shows on the air. That is to say, during last year's vacation, I actually recorded some of the pre-recorded programs while I was away on vacation. So there wasn't this extended period away from the microphone. Yesterday, for the first time, sitting down to a 2-hour stretch at the microphone, I came away at the end of the show. This sometimes happens when there are particularly involved shows, but this was very pronounced. I was like winded and dizzy. I was out of practice for having spoken into the microphone for so long. And I mean, you're just sitting in a chair. It doesn't occur to you that there is anything that involves effort in it. I mean, not in the physical sense, but it's really, apparently it requires constant work and physical training. I was winded and dizzy from lack of oxygen at the end of the show, and it was really kind of a strange feeling. That has happened from time to time, but it was very pronounced yesterday. So I guess you can't just walk in here and do it. You kind of have to work your way up to it and be doing it more or less every day with only short breaks in between, or else you lose the edge. That is interesting. That sort of surprised me. Anyway, we can get ourselves dizzy like we feel like a lack of oxygen today just from the subject matter that we have to cover. We can go in, of course, as usual, any number of directions. Just straight up hard news. I'm reporting to you that, for instance, new indictment out yesterday, or I guess not an indictment. Apparently I saw somebody insisting that it wasn't an indictment, it was a criminal complaint, because they've arrested Maria Butina. And I think we're pronouncing her name correctly, but you of course remember her name from this show. We've read lots of articles about her, and she is usually described, and I saw another good point being made yesterday, usually described as that Russian gun rights advocate who worked very hard at trying to create closer ties between the National Rifle Association, the NRA here at home, and I guess what she liked to describe, or others liked to describe on her behalf when they wrote articles about her, as a burgeoning gun rights movement in Russia. I'm not so sure that there is such a thing in the same sense that there is one here. But anyway, she described herself usually as a gun rights advocate, and it's a bit of a misnomer for a number of reasons, not the least of which is it turns out that she is actually a spy and not really so much of a gun rights advocate as a Jack, or I guess Jane, of all trades on the spy end of things. And I guess the notion of exploiting Americans, the mania of certain Americans, right-wing Americans in particular, for what they lump under the umbrella of gun rights, was a great entree into a fracture point in American politics, and a spy whose assignment was to exacerbate the fractures in American politics would find the gun rights crowd a very fertile field for that kind of game, and that's the one she chose. She may have chosen it because she has a personal passion for guns and gun rights to the extent that they exist at all in Russia. and that would just be a happy bonus. But it seems like she just basically did what was necessary to create and exacerbate fracture points. She also shows up, many people were pointing out, in different roles, slightly different roles, at least two that I am aware of and can bring up this morning. One was an appearance at a candidate Donald Trump press conference in 2015, which she attends in the capacity of a reporter. And remember, we're all a little bit uncertain about what constitutes reporter these days, and have been for a long time. And it's time for a blogger ethics conference to figure out exactly who is which. It's really not, of course, an old joke from the early blog days. But yeah, I mean, there's always some question as to whether an independent person who, for whatever reason feels it's good for their work or just fun or maybe professionally required to adhere to journalistic standards could, in fact, consider themselves to be an independent journalist publishing on their own blog. I always approached blogging very differently and never really considered myself to be a journalist, though certainly there were others working in the same space who did. So that blurs the lines too. So I guess we afford her a certain amount of line blurring if we want to be fair. On the other hand, maybe we don't want to be fair to Russian spies. This is what we're going to be talking about today. It's a lot of, I don't know what metaphysics really are. So there's a lot of meta to this. A lot of things about this side of the storyline, which people would refer to as meta, and they might be right and they might be wrong. I don't really know. I've never really gone in for what is the definition of metaphysics. It's always been sort of I've never been interested in it long enough to go and figure out whether I was using the word right or not, and which is surprising considering how obsessed I am about that usually. Anyway, we're going to be talking about some real weird definitional problems today because there's a lot of different approaches to thinking about the things that happened yesterday. So just to stick with this one subject for a second, Maria Butina was, in 2015, spotted in playing the role of journalist, asking a question at a Trump press conference, which appears to have been designed to afford then candidate Trump the opportunity to say that he was in favor of lifting sanctions, then existing American sanctions against Russia, which was a long-term goal of the Russians and a part of the goal of the infamous Trump Tower collusion meeting, where Natalia Veselnitskaya shows up and makes essentially the same ask. Maria Butina, though, I think became most famous to us as the middle person between the gun rights NRA crowd here in the United States and the Russian operatives on the other side looking to do their best to manipulate the election. We read lots of articles about them, and it was fun yesterday to be able to say, oh, we were way ahead of the curve. She gets arrested, and while others are doing a who is Maria Butina story, we are able to look back and say, hey, we know her, Maria Butina. We've read all about her. I remind you, we read all about her because part of the fun everyone was having was saying, oh, if you just rely on the mainstream media or whatever euphemism you want to use for that, you might have no idea who she is and be way behind the curve, whereas if you are a Kagro in the Morning listener, you would know plenty about what was happening and who she was and why she was being arrested and how interesting that was. Of course, as I constantly remind you, you would know that because people who I think, maybe you wouldn't consider them mainstream media. Maybe you consider them something slightly different. Maybe mainstream media to you is literally simply the New York Times, Washington Post, I don't know, Newsweek, Time Magazine. And you don't consider, for whatever reason, Mother Jones or the Daily Beast or any other of the popular online publications, though Mother Jones originally started as a magazine, I know, to be mainstream media. Well, I don't know how I would consider it either. I'm only saying that I never investigated Maria Butina myself. I read it in the press. So there are members of the press who are way ahead of everything. They're ahead of me. They're ahead of you. They're ahead of all of us. And we thank them for their work, because without it, we couldn't sit around feeling like we were ahead of the curve. We are ahead of the curve. It's just that the curve is very big. They're at the very leading edge of it before it even begins to curve. And, you know, we're up there in the front too, because we read what they had to say. Anyway, so Butina arrested. Interesting. It's going to be kind of a wild and bumpy ride. Yesterday, of course, also just after getting off the air, I guess, Trump went ahead with his secret behind closed doors meeting with Vladimir Putin. And I think it's safe to say at this point that he did spill national security secrets to him in a very stupid way that would endanger the sovereignty of the United States of America and probably the lives of American service members and probably intelligence community operatives as well, though he may not know it or have meant to have done it. But since that's usually his MO at these meetings, I would say I can't prove it to you now. I'm telling you that fairly soon, within the next couple of months, I guess, this is how long it takes sometimes to play these things out, we will be reading someone else's original reporting that will reveal to us what exactly was spilled and in what way. People familiar with the news. And I know that he kept everyone out of the meeting in order, he said, to prevent leaks. The problem is the biggest leaker in the White House is Donald Trump himself. What he was really, of course, preventing was the collection of evidence against him of his collusion, continuing collusion, and his treason with the Russian president. And the leaks will come from him later. He'll provide them, and then he'll say, this is outrageous, people are leaking. And he'll forget that he told everybody he was bringing no one with him. So the only possible leaker could be him. But again, this gets to part of our metaphysical problem. Is it a leak? Seriously, this is a good entree into where my head has been today. And I don't know if we'll spend the whole day on it or not, but is it a leak? If the president of the United States tells it to a member of the press and you know, does his whole act. Oh, don't tell anybody I told you this. It's off the record. It's on background. You have to say I'm a senior White House official familiar with the situation. And now anyone would be able to put together, there's only one person, senior or otherwise, who's familiar with the situation if there really was a meeting in which there were no other Americans present besides Donald Trump. I mean, we could also spend a whole day on how insane that is to agree to do such a thing. Even if you're not a traitor, just, you know, because it would be dumb to try and figure out what got said later on. If you were, you know, if such a thing was important to you or anybody else, Donald Trump would not be the guy to send in there. I know he loves to say he has terrific memory. I have one of the great memories in the entire world, which of course means he has no memory whatsoever. You know, this is how Donald Trump works. But is he a leaker? Now, the Warlock here is tweeting to me that he's not a leaker. And that's kind of what I'm saying. He is and he isn't. And that's one of the big issues of the day. There's I don't know if you would call it a school, but it's certainly a line of thought, which would tell us that the president isn't a leaker, can't be a leaker. And in some ways, it's related to the line of thought that tells us, and we reject this line of thought usually, that the president can't break the law because he's the president. It's impossible. And you can't indict a president and you can't try a president for a crime. And nothing the president does is illegal because it's the president who's doing it. Now, the Warlock says, no, he is not one. That's okay. I have a radio show and I say he is one. But he also isn't one because he's the president of the United States. But it's also fairly obvious and on the record. It's now clear and it's been reported that, yes, there are people who are working in the press corps as professional reporters who have had as their source someone who could only be the president but were prevailed upon to cite them as a senior White House official instead. It's fairly cut and dried. But the question of whether or not the president can be said to have leaked something. Well, okay, what is a leak for one thing? All right, here he goes. I mean, you want to do a show? Go ahead and do a show. I mean, you could go ahead and do that. A leak, he says, and I agree, by definition, is something that violates some level of confidentiality. And the issue is there such a thing with the president of the United States? I don't know if this is where you're going with this, but like I said, if you want to go with it, you can go with it on a show of your own and go for it. I'm on mine, so here I go. It's there's more than just confidentiality, of course. There's the question of classification, formal or informal. When we like to talk about classified information, certainly there's information that bears directly on the national security, or even indirectly on the national security. And it is illegal for most people, anyway, to reveal that information without authorization. The difficulty comes from the way we've designed our system. And this is at the heart of all of the problems that we'll eventually discuss, definitional and otherwise. We have delegated to the President of the United States the burden, the obligation, and the job, the role of being the final arbiter of the classification system. It is presidential authority that underlies the establishment of the classification system at all. The reason that something is illegal to reveal is because it's classified. It's classified because presidential authority is invoked in imposing on this information and our system of our taxonomy of sorting our information, that certain information is to be held in the highest confidence among people, who are vetted for security clearance, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, it's the President of the United States who can, one, say whether or not a person is cleared to know this information, and B, did I say one or A? Well, yeah, there's another taxonomy problem. Secondly, however I classified it, it's up to the presidential authority from which the classification system is derived also means that the president can himself or herself, yes, instantly classify, I guess, or certainly declassify. This is what we've actually dealt with in the past. Declassify certain information, either for limited purposes or for general purposes. We are about to, drop an atomic bomb on, let's say, Scotland. Why? I don't know. We wouldn't normally want to do this, but let's say we had secret plans to do so, and the president had drawn them up, and he, tells Ivanka, and she blurts it out somewhere. And everybody says, oh my God, national security violation. The president can say, no, I authorized her to have that information, and in fact, I did it retroactively. Plus, I just declassified that information. Can he do that? Can he say, well, no, it's not classified because I just instantly declassified it? Yes, no, sort of, maybe with a little help or support elsewhere in the law, but ultimately the outcome is, yeah, it's going to be okay for Ivanka, even if he has to rely on falling back on saying, well, even if I'm wrong about my ability to instantly or retroactively declassify information like that, I can always pardon Ivanka. And so the functional equivalent is it's okay for her to do that. And so since it all resolves itself the same way, it is sort of thought of in that way that the president can decide something's not classified, decide that someone who leaked something is no longer a leaker, et cetera, et cetera. Let's see. What else can we say? The Warlock is busy insisting that Trump revealing stuff off the record is not a leak. And again, it depends on what's being revealed off the record. If I take classified information and reveal it and say it's off the record, that is a leak. So there you go. That problem is now solved. I've just shown you how you can leak information using off-the-record discussion with a journalist. Journalist's not supposed to have this information because it's classified. Doesn't matter whether I offer it to them on the record or off the record. Giving it to them means I have improperly disseminated classified information. That's a leak, and I did it. Can Trump simply say, it's okay because if you want to try and arrest me for it, I'll simply retroactively declassify it and or pardon myself? Sure. Rather than try and resolve that issue, courts or prosecutors or the Office of the Office of Legal Counsel inside the White House will simply say, this is a problem that evaporates into the ether when you try and figure it out. And so the functional bottom line of it is, that's all. Trump is allowed to do it is your objection. I cannot do it. You definitely can't do it. He may or may not be allowed to do it. It's simply a matter of functionally, if the president wishes not to be prosecuted for it or some other person not to be prosecuted. In fact, you say you can't do it. You can do it after the fact. If you did it and the president said, yes, but you shall not be held liable for it, you would not be held liable for it. So if you do it and there's no punishment for it, can you do it or can you not do it? You can stand there and say, yeah, well, on principle, I should not have done it, or I should not have been allowed to do it, but I was, and so I did, and that's it. You did do it, and you can do it. If, again, definitional problem. If can and can't hinges on punishment or non-punishment. Can the president do it? It is widely assumed to be the case that he can, only because it's the cleanest way of resolving a difficulty between an immovable object and an irresistible force. Is classification law absolute? Probably not. Is the president's right to pardon himself absolute? People say yes, but the answer may be no. And the problem is, for instance, let us say that we go with the widely held assumption that it is okay for the president to do it. It is okay, as egregious as it seems, for the president to pardon himself. Ordinarily, it's the kind of question, the kind of headache that, bothers the Supreme Court as much as it bothers the Office of Legal Counsel. We don't know how to solve this one. And so they very frequently will say, we will not, simply won't solve this one. We'll say it's a political question, has to be solved at the ballot box, will of the people, consent to the governed, yada, yada. We don't interfere in such questions and don't decide on such questions. However, as I've told you, as Armando has told you numerous times, suppose the day comes that 5 of them say, to hell with that, I am deciding. Who is there to say, you may not? Who is there to say, no, it's a political question and it always has been? That's been the doctrine of the Supreme Court for, since not forever, but for quite a long time. And they say that was a fiction, a convenience that we invented for ourselves to avoid answering the question. Today we feel like answering the question. 4 justices disagree and think we should stick to principle and stay away from this. 5 justices disagree. And they may even have 5 different reasons for disagreeing with sticking to principle. And likewise, 10 different reasons among them for why such a question ought to be settled in the negative. That is to say that, no, the president can't pardon himself. It's always been assumed to be the case that he could, but today we decide he can't. 5 of them sign in the right place, and it's done. He can't pardon himself. And if tomorrow, the next day, the next hour, minutes later, seconds, milliseconds later, in fact, retroactively, if they have decided another case that they already started working on that they want to come out the other way, if they can get 5 justices to say the exact same fact pattern on a different day or in some different context, even if it's the same facts, the same action, in a different context shall mean for our purposes that the president can pardon himself, they can do it. It doesn't have to make sense. That's the power we've delegated to those people in our Constitution. We didn't have to. It can change. It could be ruled to mean something else one day. But we did give that away. That was part of our deal. We're going to all be free to conduct our lives and pursue happiness in our various ways. And these people will have the job of deciding what the hell the law is, isn't, means, doesn't mean, whether it's logical or not. And similar things go on all over the place and throughout government, which is why we have a problem with deciding whether or not something was treason or not. And today, there's plenty of academic writing, which comes from sources we usually find, some of whom we reject out of hand almost all the time, and some of whom we find very interesting and informative and persuasive, usually, and who this time give us reason for some discomfort. Was it treason? And, it doesn't really have to be... it doesn't all have to hinge on whether or not it was treason. If you find if you feel like you have some other word for it that's equally disturbing and weighty, and you feel like using it, I won't argue about it with you. But the question of whether or not collusion is treason is another one of these questions that breaks the same way. Is it? Some say yes. Some say no. And the question is, I guess, ultimately, if you were to approach this problem a certain way, that is to say, through the courts, then, yeah, eventually the answer, such as it is, we've been told that our answers come from the Supreme Court. And if 5 justices on day one say that thing which was done here is treason, then that's that. It's treason. Unless, of course, you overthrow the government of the United States and replace the Supreme Court and say we're going to hold a retroactive trial and to hell with double jeopardy. That doesn't count anymore because the Constitution has been trashed. And if the next day they say the same thing is not treason, then it's not again. That's the way it works. It's actually quite annoying. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. A little trouble with the mute button this morning. Another storyline which is developing. I don't want to leave this one because I really think we probably could and should spend all year probably on this question. But another Maria Butina story sort of developing this morning. The question of whether or not Maria Butina somehow ends up in a third very weird situation, which is, let's see, Emily Kahn, or rather Emily Kahn Singer now, senior political reporter at Mike and Roll Call and God knows where else, according to this quick bio, had tweeted around this morning a photo of that weird White House Oval Office meeting between Donald Trump and the Russian delegation back in whatever it was it May of 2017, in which it's literally hours after Trump has fired James Comey and he receives the Russian ambassador and foreign minister Lavrov and Kislyak, and tells them, that he's relieved this great pressure on himself by relieving, by firing James Comey. That was the meeting at which there was no American press involved, and there was a big Russian delegation, and the Russian press covered the meeting, and it was, the first, essentially, like, baby step towards a regular series of one-on-one meetings unmonitored with Vladimir Putin. But everyone remembers that story. And there's a crowd of people at the door of the Oval Office making their way in. There's Sergei Lavrov is sort of leading the pack, and a bunch of Russians, and maybe not, some Americans mixed in there. I can't tell who everybody is, and that's one of the problems with this thing, is that there was no publicly available list of names of who met in the Oval Office there by design. The White House is just not into telling people who met with the president because, of course, it's evidence of his criminality, so, he doesn't document such things. Anyway, lurking in the background of the picture, somebody with sharp eyes spotted someone who looks exactly pretty much like Maria Butina is hovering in the background there. And what a look on her face, too. She is looking directly at the camera with a sort of sheepish grin almost that seems to say, I am here as a spy, and I really should not have made it this far into the White House, but Trump is either so dumb and so complicit that I've been escorted into the Oval Office here, and what a situation this is. And indeed, the photo was circulated, as I said, by Emily Singer, who said along with it, I thought this was a Photoshop, but it's not. This is Maria Butina, arrested, as we know, yesterday for being a Russian spy in the Oval Office with Trump. And that does seem rather sensational, doesn't it? And immediately she was asked, do you have a link to the original? And she provided it. It was in the New York Times. So it clearly wasn't Photoshopped, unless you're one of those people that believes that the New York Times Photoshopped Maria Butina into this picture in May of last year for some unknown reason, because they're time travelers, something like that, and they knew it would come back to bite them. So that did seem rather spectacular, but not out of keeping with what the Russians were doing at that point, if you, I guess, believe that they were doing anything. If you don't believe they were doing anything, then you're not going to be convinced about this. So now, though, we have further developments on this. Sabrina Siddiqui now tweets, she's a political reporter for The Guardian, and she says now, contrary to speculation, I'm told that the woman in the back is not Maria Butina, but likely NSC staffer Kari, C-A-R-I, Lutkins, Lutkins, working on obtaining full list of names from meeting, which was not provided last year when it took place. Photo came from Russian state media. U.S. press were denied access. And that's the big problem with all of it, is there's nobody that you can trust if you think you can trust the American media, whatever. Again, we have definitional problems with everything. That's half the show, is us casting doubt on ourselves. Am I speaking out of turn by saying I think it's safer to trust the New York Times when they say, they didn't make this list available last year, than it is to trust Russian media when they say, no, that is someone completely different. 'Cause I'm looking at the picture, and I got to tell you, it looks just like her. But then again, it is said that Kari Lutkins looks something like this Maria Butina too. And there are pictures available. I don't know which one is it. There's more than one Kari Lutkins out there, undoubtedly. But there are some pictures where you could say, arguably, they do look alike. And in some photos, more so than in others. And I would guess that in this picture here of Kari Lutkins that Google Images brings up, with her alongside John Bolton. Now, that would be my best verification. That's the Kari Lutkins we're talking about. And it's entirely possible that it could be her. The other photos that came up are a little less clear, but certainly probably the best one going in terms of figuring out which Kari Lutkins are we talking about here. Do we have the right person? You'd have to go with the one where she's with Bolton. And yeah, that could be her, but it's pretty easy to think it's Butina too. Let me take a quick look at images. I mean, we should certainly. Everything is so difficult to define here. I was going to say we should certainly feel better about the possibility that it's an NSC staff or an American in the Oval Office than not. However, this NSC staff, I don't really know. I mean, do I feel better? Bolton wasn't there at the time in the White House. But would I feel better with John Bolton being in the Oval Office than Maria Butina? I think a little bit, but I'm not entirely rather not entirely certain that that's the case. So let me see. Maria Butina. Yeah, I guess on further review, maybe Carrie Lutkins is the better call here. It looks like she has a narrower nose and somewhat darker hair, but it's very easy to. There are some photos in which you could actually, convince yourself of the opposite. So anyway, luckily we didn't get to that story before Sabrina Siddiqui and I assume others brought up the same objection that it wasn't really her. That would have been rather extraordinary, but not beyond the pale. Anyway, I was speaking before the break about the various other issues with which we'll have definitional problems. And hinting to you that there was a lot of writing out there today about, is this treason or is it not? And I don't know how much time you want to spend in your own life trying to decide where you come down on it. But supposing you wanted to spend a lot and you wanted our help in trying to decide how you would solve that question for yourself. Let's say that happened. We could start with something very basic, a sort of a roundup by Newsweek, and it's always going to be pretty basic when you're talking about a roundup from Newsweek, of law professors and practitioners. Did Trump commit treason at the Putin meeting? Here's what lawyers say. And of course, lawyers are only a guide in all of this, and all the legal reasoning in the world may or may not actually solve the question because, the 5 justices, if you take the question to them, may decide on something other than strictly legal basis. Or if you take the question up the chain in, the executive branch instead, they may simply end up saying, look, the president orders this, and so it cannot be treason, just like it's not illegal if the president does it. Yes, but didn't we once decide that that really wasn't true, and we didn't believe that as a country, that even that no one was above the law, even the president? Yeah, once we did decide that, sort of, in a way, and we all sort of thought that was where we settled. But today we say no. Today we feel different. And, well, who are you to say? You can't be the judge in your own case, Mr. President, or whatever it is we should call you. Yes, I can. And if you don't think so, what are you going to do about it? Because, the only alternative you have is to force me from power physically, and I have a Praetorian Guard to prevent that. Oh, well, that is bad, isn't it? Anyway, a much more simplistic view of things, compiled for us by Shane Croucher in Newsweek. So, was it treason or not? If you care about how others define it, let's take a look. There are many things you can accuse President Donald Trump of, and treason is now apparently one of those after his controversial press conference with Russia's President Vladimir Putin at their summit in Helsinki. And I mentioned yesterday that I think that's actually the pronunciation that they use way up north. I only think so because I think that's the pronunciation that was being used by the Iceland air agent that met our incoming flight at the gate looking for people who might be late for their transfers to connecting flights to Helsinki and also Frankfurt. But Helsinki, I've never heard it said that way. And maybe that's only Icelandic people say it that way. Or maybe he's not even Icelandic. I don't know. Anyway, Donald Trump's press conference performance in Helsinki rises to and exceeds the threshold of high crimes and misdemeanors, tweeted John Brennan, the former CIA director. CIA directors probably really love accusing people of treason whenever they can, and Maybe their definitions of it make sense in some ways that ours don't, or maybe they're just overly sensitive about such things. Anyway, it was nothing short of treasonous, he says. Not only were Trump's comments imbecilic, and that's not by itself treason, although, when you're talking about the person of the president of the United States, I think really they owe a duty to us not to be imbecilic. Not only were Trump's comments imbecilic, he is wholly in the pocket of Putin. Republican patriots, where are you? 3 question marks for that one. And the answer is there is no such thing, but that's my personal opinion. Brennan's premise, though, is that at the press conference, Trump appeared to side with Putin over America's own intelligence agencies on the issue of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Putin denies what the U.S. intelligence community is telling Trump, that the Kremlin used cyber warfare to undermine American democracy. And Trump, whose 2016 campaign is under investigation by special counsel Robert Mueller over suspicions of collusion with the Russian government, seems to believe Putin. Okay. Should we pause here and discuss, or should we just go ahead? I think we probably should read through and get a couple of varying looks at the thing and then go back and comment on it, even if we lose specific points along the way. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I don't know what that means. I have President Putin. But okay. He just said it's not Russia. Trump told reporters after the pair met. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. That's rather remarkable. I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today. And that rankled a lot of people for various reasons. And there's a lot of levels to it, but you know what they are. According to federal law on treason, and there is one, 18 U.S. Code Section 2381. And this is the basics of it. Whoever, owing allegiance to the United States, levies war against them or adheres to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort within the United States or elsewhere, even Helsinki, is guilty of treason and shall suffer death, or be imprisoned not less than 5 years and fined under this title, but not less than $10,000. So another one of those ancient laws. $10,000 to Donald Trump. If he had cash, that would, not be much to him. But the statute continues, by the way. So it's like, well, we might execute you, or, you could do maybe 5 years and get fined $10,001. Seems like a broad range we allow for treason these days. Well, all days. All right. So whoever owing allegiance to the United States, and we can assume that he owes allegiance to the United States. There's an oath of office, et cetera, et cetera. And I think most people would just come down and, look, it's another one of those problems. Most people would say, of course he owes allegiance to the United States. He takes an oath. Can't assume the office, we've argued on this show. But again, who knows? 5 justices feel the opposite, then I'm wrong. And I'm just pre-wrong now. I don't know it. I don't know that later on in the future, 5 idiots will say, who cares what language means? But okay, you take an oath, and most people would say, all right, that creates a duty of allegiance to the United States, unless 5 justices say it doesn't, even if he does take it. I have my fingers crossed. Does that count? Good enough for us, say 5 justices. Oh, well, that's stupid. That's going to incentivize everybody to cross their fingers. So be it. We're just going to have to live with it. So whoever owing allegiance to the United States levies war against them. What is that? Is it cyber war? That's another whole avenue of inquiry. Does that count? Or adheres to their enemies? Does it matter? Kissing Putin's butt and doing whatever he wants. Is that adhering to an enemy? Well, what if he's not an enemy? This is part of our definitional problem. Giving them aid and comfort within the United States or elsewhere, it doesn't matter that it was in Helsinki, is guilty of treason, shall suffer anything from, 50 lashes with a wet noodle to death, and shall be incapable of holding any office under the United States. Well, Trump's already incapable of holding any office under the United States. So what does he care, right? It's not a very scary statute, except for the death part. And since this is interesting, right? Now if we should say, that's it, forget impeaching Trump, execute Trump, then of course you're reminded, no, it is an illiberal thing, and a non-progressive thing to advocate for the death penalty. Ooh, darn. Well, I never really signed up for that one. But generally speaking, I think we apply it very badly, and I'm willing to sign on to that portion of the argument. Anyway, since execution of Trump is not currently in the offing, by the way, if you tweet something, like if you tweeted a death threat to the president, I think you are in trouble with the Secret Service. Now, if you were to start tweeting that you wanted to see Trump executed for treason after after a due process is afforded and he is indicted, arrested, tried, and convicted, and then sentenced to death, and by all the right legal processes, are you in trouble for that? If you're just saying, I'm not saying do it now or extra legally, I'm saying let's let the process take its course. So can you be? I guess you probably could. That's another definitional problem. Are you threatening the life of the president? No, I'm simply upholding the rule of law. Well, it's a bit of a gray area. Anyway, you see that this problem arises everywhere. We'll continue with the article, though, instead, to try and give us a better basis to contemplate this stuff. In Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, of course, there's mention of treason. It says, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them. Did the founders contemplate cyber war? Who can say for sure? Or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. That's where all that language comes from. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in open court. And confession in a press conference probably doesn't count unless, of course, 5 justices say it does. Or that, well, the Constitution says 2 witnesses, but you really need 35 or 1 or none. Whatever we have to say today. But that's crazy. Yeah. All right. Well, what do you go to the Supreme Court to ask that question? No. Again, we're stuck with the one we've got. Now, Lawrence Tribe, who is the one who was tweeting around this article, he wanted everybody to know what he said about whether or not it was treason. And he says that if one defines war to include cyber war, e.g. by deliberately hacking into a nation's computer-based election infrastructure, which is to say, he's defining cyber war as war, then what we witnessed in Helsinki was President Trump openly aiding and abetting the Russian military's ongoing war against America rather than protecting against that Putin-led cyber invasion. But that may be a rather large assumption on his part. Is a good guy to be out there making nice assumptions. So he's a Harvard law professor. He's entitled to make assumptions about such things. But they are assumptions, and you might disagree with them. And by the way, does anybody know about the pronunciation of Helsinki? Did I hear that wrong? Where's Bjorn? Are you on vacation, Bjorn? Are you in Oslo right now? Are you listening? Do you still listen to the show? Are you interested in our trips to Iceland? You've probably been 100 times, so you're probably bored by that stuff. Do you say Helsinki? Do Finns say Helsinki? Do Icelanders say Helsinki? Am I crazy about this thing? These are the things that occupy my mind. Not treason, not the definition of classification or consent to the governed, but how do you say what I've always said, Helsinki? Helsinki to me. Helsinki to someone else. But isn't it symbolic of everything we're discussing today? No? Oh, all right. Anyway, so Tribe says, yeah, if cyber war is war, and that's a big if, but then again, remember all the things that we saw justified under the authorization to use military force, the AUMF, following 9/11 attacks, and people who said this is so overbroad. And some people said it had to be necessarily overbroad because the nature of warfare has changed, except, at least with terrorism, both terrorism of that type anyway, 9/11 type, and war as we previously understood it both involve explosions, and so it's very easy to tell that you're in the same territory. Cyber war, though, typically involves no explosions unless you hack the electrical grid and, screw with nuclear reactors and they explode. I don't know. You could certainly produce explosions, but it could be done without. Is it war? If there's no explosions, it's not war, say the kids. I don't know. Lawrence Tribe has a better and broader view of it, but is it the end-all, be-all? He continues by saying that in turn, and that's a big turn, right? Well, if what they did is war, then fine. Okay, but that's a big step. But he says that in turn could be reasonably be defined as treason within the meaning of 18 U.S. Code 2381 and Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, except for the two witnesses part. I wouldn't even bother referencing the Constitution. But okay, that he's talking about the war part. Some scholars would resist that modern definition, as one of the authors of the Constitution could not have contemplated, like Brett Kavanaugh might say that. There's no way the founders they certainly had not had cyber warfare in mind, and they probably didn't consider soft warfare, even if you wanted to call it warfare, or soft projection of power to be warfare. They probably had a very hard, old-timey definition of war, probably which included, and necessarily, a formal declaration of war, which we're not going to get here either. But I think most Americans have kind of moved past that. In the age of terrorism, we now say, the formal declaration of war, even on our part, doesn't count as much. We just use an authorization for the use of military force instead as a quick and easy substitute for a declaration of war. But surely it would be a stretch to say, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, sure, James Madison, all thought one day computers could be manipulating information in such a way that we could consider it to be warfare. And strict constitutionalist who had an interest in keeping the president out of trouble, coincidentally, might then say, no chance that this could be war. Some scholars, as I said, he said, would resist that modern definition as one of the authors of the Constitution could not have contemplated, and others would insist on limiting the definition to situations involving a state of formally declared war, but views like Brennan's are far from wild, said Tribe. And he doesn't mean Justice Brennan, he means our former FBI director, Brennan. Jens David Olin, Vice Dean and Professor of Constitutional Law at Cornell Law School. I didn't give you Lawrence Tribe's full recitation of his titles because most of you already know. Look, he's a Harvard Law School guy. Olin, you don't know him, Cornell. He told Business Insider, from which Newsweek stole this, I guess, Trump is clearly helping Russia. Whether it rises to the level of aid and comfort would be for a jury to decide, or for the House of Representatives to decide if it pursues articles of impeachment. In other words, it's not up to me, and I couldn't tell you what people are going to decide, and that's not exactly ceding the question or sidestepping it with the political question doctrine. He does say a jury could decide it. And if a jury can decide it, that's only because ultimately the Supreme Court would have a shot at it if they wanted it to say, that's not even properly the provenance of a jury. We're going to throw the whole thing out. They could do that after the fact. So it's not even clear that the jury would have the right to decide such a thing. And normally we assume the House of Representatives would be said to have the right to do that, and there would be a very strong constitutional argument that they do. However, if for some reason you ended up with a case in court and the highest court in the land decided, yes, we're going to hear it, yes, we're going to decide it on the merits, and no, you don't have that right, then you have a real problem on your hands and you don't know what to do with it. And we'd probably all sit by and say, damn, that was weird. And that would be the end of it. So, could a jury decide? Maybe. Could the House of Representatives decide? Maybe. We all think they could. Could something wacky happen? Yes, you bet. Is it likely to happen? No. But then neither was the situation where there was a president who just said, you know what, I like Russia better than the United States. I am the president of the United States. I want to do what they want. Again, There's another definitional issue that comes up there. Let's get through this damn article and a few others before we get too far into the discussion at the higher level. Here's more opinion on which you can base your thoughts. John Shattuck, professor of practice in diplomacy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, which is in America, which is on the North American continent, part of our tectonic plate, part of which, by the way, is over in Iceland. Just wanted to do that to you. He wrote in the Boston Globe, from which Newsweek stole this, that Trump's pre-summit comments implied that he would not use the tools of diplomacy, law, or military technology to defend the United States against continuing Russian cyber attacks. If true, this would be tantamount to giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Lots of issues, problems, twists and turns to all of this. Trump's pre-summit comments, do they count for anything? Maybe, yes, no. They implied, to who? To me? To you? I don't know. That he would not use the tools of diplomacy, law, or military technology to defend the United States against continuing Russian cyber attacks. And then you get into the question of, well, were they cyber attacks? They were certainly cyber. Do the Russians think they're attacks? No. But does their opinion count in all this? Well, probably not, I guess. Are there Americans, though, of consequence, who say also that they weren't attacks? Well, yes, as it happens, one very important one, or supposedly important one to whom we're supposed to give great deference in such things, the President of the United States, if he is that, because we don't really know. But for the working on the assumption that he is President of the United States, then he's able to say such things. There we get into the next big definitional issue, and it's hard to avoid it except for the fact that a break is coming up. That'll give us a chance to avoid it and go back to the article after the break. But oops, I got the wrong music here. Let's get that one rolling. Oh, yeah. All right. Well, anyway, the point is this. The big question that's still looming out there, and it's one that we've actually discussed on the show before, but only once or twice. If the duly elected president of the United States, if Barack Obama had done this, imagine if Barack Obama did this. Well, imagine if he did do this. Imagine if he said, my foreign policy is this. We are going to be closer to Russia than ever before. Is that illegitimate on its face? Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio, back after just a brief break. Who knows whether I even got the last word in during our, right before our hard break. But I was asking the question of, the old trope now of imagine if Barack Obama had done this. But really, you should imagine this. Yeah, you know what the Republican response would be. That's not actually the issue here. The question. The question is, if Barack Obama had said, and I guess you have to start with the premise that, okay, for purposes of this question, we assume that enough Americans assume Barack Obama to legitimately be the president of the United States that there's no functional question of whether or not his orders would be followed as commander-in-chief or his word would be taken as president of the United States. That's something that's gone now, but whatever. So the question here is, if Barack Obama were to say, it's simply, in my opinion, as essentially the chief diplomat of the United States, and that's a role that the president occupies. We always refer to the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and et cetera, et cetera. But, it doesn't even require adherence to the unitary executive theory to consider that the chief diplomat, the person who sets the foreign policy of the United States with respect to diplomatic relations with others, if not legal relations with other countries that might, for instance, require a treaty or some action by Congress. But the chief diplomat of the United States is the president of the United States, and his ambassadors are to be expected to convey his views faithfully or resign from their position if they can't do it, and to execute to the extent foreign policy, can do such things, to execute his view of how relations with other countries ought to be conducted. If a fully legitimate, or someone presumed to be a fully legitimate president of the United States, and if it's easier for you to imagine this the case with Barack Obama than Donald Trump, then so be it. If Barack Obama were to say, I've been thinking and thinking and thinking on this, and it seems to me we have been approaching our relationships with Russia all wrong. We ought to be not only in political harmony with Russia, because we agree on so many fronts and share so many, shared values. That's what we do with shared values. We share them. Yes, I understand that I doubled up on that. But that we ought to enter into literal political union with them. Just as the old Soviet Union once included Ukraine as part of its national territory, since ceded in the breakup of the Soviet Union, but it was a union, a political union. They were one political entity. The rulers of Russia and Moscow and the rest of traditional borders of Russia were the same as those who exercised ultimate sovereignty over Ukraine. Ukraine had its own local officials, of course, yada, yada, but it was widely recognized that if you walked into what is Ukraine in the period from 1944 to 1989, you were in the sovereign territory of the Soviet Union, right? But we ought to enter into serious, actual, literal political union with Russia, such that Russia and the United States were one political entity. And to smooth the transition, I would cede ultimate leadership in this political union to the Russian president, in this case, Vladimir Putin. Would that be on its face an inadmissible or illegal or invalid approach to American foreign policy? Now, on its face, most people would immediately say, "Well, you can't just do that." And in all likelihood, there would be legal problems with just doing that. But supposing that was something you wanted so badly that you were willing to try to follow whatever approximation of due process we decided as a political entity to ask for, is it something that simply couldn't be? I mean, it's a weird question, and it's a weird situation, but it is something that's happened before, not with the United States, but, well, I don't know. I mean, I guess depending on how you view admissions of states to the United States or the admission of territories or the gaining, however we would refer to it. It's been so long since we acquired territory in that way. I mean, it's long to me because I wasn't alive during the World War II period. But, I mean, how do we deal with it post-war? Pacific possessions and things like that. I don't know. It doesn't necessarily matter very much. The United States hasn't done it for a long time. But, of course, there are other examples. There was, we brought up the Soviet Union. There was like literal political union for a brief time in the United Arab Republic, as between, what was it, Iraq and Syria and Egypt. And I mean, those are non-contiguous areas. How did they deal with that? Well, we got non-contiguity all over the place. Alaska, Hawaii, not contiguous with the United States. Puerto Rico, but it's not a state, not contiguous with the United States. Never mind American Samoa, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on and on. Long Beach Island, for that matter, if you really want to. if having a waterway in between. Staten Island, we could be rid of that and not have much objection from a lot of people. But those don't count. But U.S. territories, we've assimilated in the past. Entire countries have gotten together, as with the United Arab Republic. You can enter into political union in a slightly different sense. Of course, our big new geopolitical foe, the European Union, not exactly the same, but in many ways, in many practices that used to differ as among sovereign states, they now have entered into a political union, not entirely erasing their borders or their identities, but that could have been the objective. Had they wanted it to be, they could simply decide that was the end they were after, and if they got agreement, they could go ahead and do that. They could erase those borders. Could the United States and Russia do the same thing? Don't have any reason to believe they ever would want to for any particular reason. But if a duly elected president of the United States said, that's the goal towards which I'm working, and that's the context in which everything should be understood, if you were that open about it, we'd have to at least contemplate making room for, in our minds, for coming to understand our relationship very differently. Why am I doing the bidding of the president of Russia? Well, because I'm working towards ultimately political union with Russia, the dissolution of the borders between us, and the unification of our governments. That would be outlandish and insane, I think, unless you are coming back from Star Trek future, in which case it makes, some amount of sense, I guess, and everybody's happy about it, and we don't have money, and we can make anything we want to eat in a little computer synthesizer, and hang out with Vulcans. But we're not there yet. But if you were to announce such a goal, would it be facially illegitimate? There would be lots of, I can't anticipate what the attacks on it would be legally. I can tell you what the attacks on it would be politically, and who they would come from and who they wouldn't come from, and whether or not that would switch directions if we suddenly changed parties in control at the White House and Republicans put in, it'd be unimaginable during the Barack Obama years that we would install a Republican president who would do such a thing. Although here we are. So, how crazy is it? But do you have to go that far? Do your goals have to be that far seeing and that explicit in order for it to be illegitimate on its face in some way for the president of the United States to say, I'm going to take my cues from Russia on this? That's just the way I see it working out best for America. We don't have to enter into political union with Russia. I think it's in the best interest of the United States to do what Russia says in this and perhaps every other situation. Is that by itself illegitimate? And I don't know that I could answer the question to everyone's satisfaction. And so long as there are 5 people, if they disagree with me, if they happen to be sitting on the Supreme Court, I am wrong. But if they just happen to be sitting in the radio audience, maybe I'm not wrong. I don't know. Or maybe I am, and they can leave and say, I'm not listening to this radio show anymore. But I don't know that there's something that's just facially wrong with that. I also don't think Donald Trump has given that any thought, nor would he. And I think even if you put that question to him and said, if you adopted this as your position and thinking liberals everywhere were willing to contemplate such a future and agree that we were uncertain now whether or not we could say your actions were facially illegitimate. In other words, it would put you in the clear. Will you admit that that's what you were up to? He may or may not say yes. And, on the one hand, he might say, oh, you mean I can do whatever I want and not be prosecuted or bothered or even harassed about it if I just say, yes, I was thinking this the whole time? He may very well say, sure, then that's what I was thinking. But he's also extraordinarily dumb or defiant, maybe even, and just say, no, that wasn't what I was thinking. I just want to do what I want to do. I don't even know what I have no plan. Would he be, I don't know why he would be honest about not having any plan, but who knows with this guy? Anything could happen. But I don't think, or I have not at any point thought that Donald Trump had a grand vision of political unification between Russia and the United States or anything like it. I do think that he's had some idea that there could be closer cooperation between the two countries, but I don't think he's given any serious thought to why that would be a good thing for America, and everybody just needed to be convinced of it. I think he's thought it would be a good thing for Donald Trump, and his kids and the business and the way they extract money. It would be great if there was greater cooperation between the United States and Russia, because people would not look askance at the way he makes money anymore, just because it was coming from Russia, which makes people, feel creeped out and weird for various reasons. Would that be enough to legitimize all of his business dealings? Well, he'd probably need more. Even if there was great cooperation between the United States and Russia, that might only end up meaning that the Russians would help us catch their money launderers and criminals more easily. Except that the problem is that now that we're not going to be entering into explicit political union with the Russians presumably are entitled to self-determination. And if they, through whatever mechanism, decide, and we decide to recognize it as legitimate, that's another big iffy question and up to the president, we decide to recognize it as legitimate, that they finally say, all right, we're coming right out with it. Oligarchy is our form of government. That's what we're doing. We don't, our elections are charades. That's okay. We admit as much. We're an oligarchy. We're a kleptocracy. We're being run by the mob. That's the way it is. And you can't say that's illegitimate, because if you do, here, we'll use your social justice warrior terminology and turn it all against you people. All you people who are for self-determination. Well, what if we determine we want to be ruled by the mob? Well, that wouldn't be self-determination, because the mob is the one deciding for everybody that they want to be run by the mob. How do you know that? Oh, you and your elections, your ethnocentricity tells you that free elections are really the best way of allowing a people to select the path of self-determination. Well, la-di-da for you. We think differently. We have cultural differences about how we determine what we want to do with ourselves, how we manifest our self-determination. Oh, gee, I hadn't thought about that. I don't want to be ethnocentric about such things. Perhaps I should back off and allow them to be authoritarian. Okay, well, now we're stuck. But do I think that Donald Trump has thought all of this? No, I just think he likes to have money, and a lot of it is coming from Russia, and to the extent that he has to change American foreign policy so that he's in less trouble with American or Russian or international authorities of any kind by claiming that this is all a part of a grand vision to bring the two entities closer politically, he may very well just claim to be doing that. We are not done, by the way, with the Newsweek article, but this, I think, was, believe it or not, necessary discussion for dealing with the rest of the article and the rest of the articles I have to share with you. We left off after saying that John Shattuck from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts had said, Trump's pre-summit comments implied that he wouldn't use the tools of diplomacy, law, or military technology to defend the United States against continuing Russian cyber attacks. He might very well, someone might say, a president of the United States might say they weren't attacks. They were cyber, but they weren't attacks. They were attempts at cyber integration, cyber political integration. We want a mind meld as between the political leadership in Russia and the political leadership in America. And so sharing data about the American political system is not out of keeping. That is why I did not want to, as he said, use the tools of diplomacy, law, or military technology to defend against the Russian participation in our shared politics. That would be counter to my diplomatic ends. Well, but you didn't. I mean, what do we say? You didn't campaign on that, so it's illegitimate? What if he didn't? I mean, what would a court think about that? Well, suppose you sue. I mean, Donald Trump tells people to sue all kinds of entities. Theresa May, sue the European Union. Why? I don't know. Sue somebody. We got to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has to ask, is the president under some obligation to use the military to try and defeat his attempts to integrate politically with another entity with whom we have he claims we have some sort of shared destiny? Shouldn't there be a vote on this somewhere? Well, he didn't say he wanted to campaign on it, and so therefore we were all fooled into electing him. No, he's entitled to change his mind. He might have campaigned against it and then changed his mind for it, or might have campaigned for it and changed his mind once in office and be against it. You can be upset about that, and you can vote against him later, but you don't get to throw him out of office because, well, you didn't say you were going to do that. That's never been part of our tradition. Now, Shattuck added to all this, the president's hostility to the U.S. investigation of Russian cyber attacks, if they are attacks, his failure to impose a cost on Russia for the attacks. Why would you impose a cost on your close friend and political soulmate, essentially? His denigration of U.S. alliances and his eagerness to have an extraordinary relationship with the Russian leader all point toward giving aid and comfort to an enemy. Maybe, maybe not. Isn't it, though, awfully strange to say we've had this tremendous, the NATO alliance, our alliance with the European Union, we're denigrating all of that and cozying up to the Russians. Well, who are the newest members of NATO? Do we know offhand? I mean, I'm going to say, aren't some of the Baltic states newly admitted to NATO? I don't know whether they're the absolute latest additions. Let's take a look at Wikipedia just to see if we're on track here in the member states of NATO. Well, the point here really is that there are several newer members of NATO who are former Soviet bloc, former Warsaw Pact members. Chock full of them. Let's see. I guess beginning in after the various political changes in Europe, Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, some of which were all incorporated into the Soviet Union itself, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Albania, Croatia Croatia, I guess, is previously part of Yugoslavia. Not aligned with the Warsaw Pact necessarily, but certainly considered Eastern Bloc. You get the idea. The point there is those countries made a decision at some point, certainly in contravention to the will of the then current leadership of those countries. There was some of which were swept out of power in a rush, and some of which slowly transitioned away from power. But East Germany reunifying with West Germany, et cetera, et cetera. These were communist countries, and the leadership was communist, and their loyalties were to Moscow. And eventually, they switched sides. They denigrated their alliances and gave aid and comfort to former enemies, and in fact joined NATO. So what if we wanted to do the same thing? Or suppose we wanted to ultimately, if we were willing to claim that there was some long-term vision where we're going to secure Star Trek-style world government and world peace by bringing Russia on board. We're going to incorporate Russia into NATO. Now, I think NATO ought to mean a different thing than the current member states. But if I can't outvote them, and I can't force them to do it as much as I try to denigrate them and berate them to pay more money. But suppose I bring in a new senior partner, like this is a big law firm. I'm going to change the culture of the firm by bringing in a gigantic rainmaker senior partner, Russia. And together, the two of us are going to pay so much of the budget of NATO that we are going to declare for ourselves the right to unilateral vetoes like we reserve for ourselves in the United Nations, because we're the big machers here. Is that doable? I'm not saying anybody else would necessarily cooperate, but I'm not saying that long term that would be an impossible outcome. If you do believe in a peaceful Star Trek world government future, how do we know that this wasn't the path that it took? It was a rocky start, but in the end, we all were hanging out with Vulcans, and we had starships and food synthesizers, and it was terrific. But at first, we were a little shaky about such things. I wasn't sure whether Chekhov was really on our side, but once I got used to it, and we all got along, and Scotty said Scotty vouched for Chekhov, and Uhura vouched for McCoy, and everybody got along. And it was wonderful, and world government was fantastic. Everybody still had accents for some reason, but we had wonderful world government. How do we know it didn't start this way? We don't. But it was always, I'm sure it was in Gene Roddenberry's mind, because if you asked him about it, I'm sure he would have said, well, it was a rocky start to begin with. But that's not what I've documented in my canon storyline of Star Trek. We didn't focus on that. Anyway, so back to the article here from Newsweek. Ross Garber is next up, adjunct professor. Adjunct what? At Tulane Law School, who represented state governors in impeachment trials. I think that's supposed to mean something. Does not believe the Constitution can be stretched or interpreted to regard Russia as an enemy against which the U.S. is at war. Aha. No matter how repugnant one might consider the president's statements in Helsinki, I'm sure he didn't say it that way, they do not meet the constitutional definition of treason, which is very narrow and addresses providing aid to an enemy. Garber told Newsweek, Russia is not technically an enemy because we are not at war with it. These matters are far too important to allow partisan aims to diminish serious constitutional analysis. But I get the point, but at the same time, well, cyber war, I mean, the things that they're doing, how is that not an attack? And that's where the argument has to lie. And, you might not be able to convince a person like this until, of course, it endangers their lives or well-being or what they want to have happen. Or a Democrat is elected this way, in which case, then it's definitely treason. Why? Because it's far too important to allow partisan aims to seriously. I just don't believe this analysis, quite honestly. But okay. Maybe he's genuine. Back in February of 2017, when the Russia investigation was beginning to unfold amid accusations of treason leveled at members of the Trump campaign, Carlton Larson, professor of law at the University of California, Davis, also concluded that Russia could not be considered a formal enemy of the United States. Speaking, and that was then, I don't know how he feels now, speaking against the government, undermining political opponents, supporting harmful policies, or even placing the interests of another nation ahead of those of the United States are not acts of treason under the Constitution, Larson wrote in the Washington Post at the time. And indeed, you could probably imagine such, again, we'll have to pretend it's Barack Obama. And certainly it's easy enough to imagine a situation in which diplomacy demands, quote unquote demands, that we take a hit on something in order to give an advantage to another country. In other words, to place the interests of another country ahead of ourselves. But you could justify it by saying, in the long run, it's best for America if we let Montenegro win on this issue. And, I mean, that's happening right now. Like, for instance, all of Trump's complaints about trade and the effect on trade that our ongoing relationship with the EU has. Like, he views these things, they're I don't even know if he's right. He may be making up his own facts about this thing. But certainly in the early years of the European Union, it was explicitly the foreign policy of the United States post-war, immediate post-war, Marshall Plan, etc., to say, yeah, we're going to take some hits economically for the purpose of rebuilding Europe, this time hopefully as a united Europe, but rebuilding them as an economic, social, and yes, probably military power again to sort of restore balance and order to the world as we see it. And it's going to take a big chunk out of America, but we can afford it, economically speaking, a big chunk out of America, but we can afford it. They can't, and we got to get them back on their feet to help, contain communism. That was the idea then. But whatever. The point was, it was in America's long-term interest to to take this hit and allow somebody else to, as Trump would put it, take advantage of us. Now, I guess you could have an argument about whether or not that time is long past. You could have arguments about whether or not they're certainly not taking advantage of us the same way that they were at the very beginning of the rebuilding of Europe. But you could probably find some situations in which you say, well, the time perhaps is long past for allowing this to happen, which inures greatly to your benefit and to our detriment, even if it's not so great anymore. So we've been in those situations. You could easily imagine a Barack Obama, or pick your favorite president, saying, we need to step back and take a little hit here and allow somebody else to come out ahead for the long-term interests of the United States. So the question is, how long-term are the interests, and are you right? And it's all kind of subjective. And, there's an argument under which you could say Donald Trump is saying that the time for granting some relative advantage to the European Union versus to ourselves is long past, and we need to stop certain deals or giveaways, and that's why we've been victimized in all this. So they're absolutely right, these more conservative views, or they're not outlandish, to say, it might be the case that supporting harmful policies or even placing the interests of another nation ahead of those of the United States are not by themselves acts of treason under the Constitution. You wouldn't want to admit to that if it was your favorite president doing it. But doesn't it feel different what he's doing now? Sure, it does. Why? Next. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, interrupting this little break to say thanks so much to all of you who are contributing supporters of Kagro in the Morning. Thousands of you are downloading the show each day, but fewer than 1 in 25 regular listeners are donating to help keep us on the air. For the money you'd spend on a single 3-minute iTunes song, we bring you 2 hours of great news and entertainment every day, 5 days a week. Patreon.com, Patreon.com makes it easy. You can find us there by searching KagroX or David Waldman or Kagro in the Morning or even Daily Coast Radio in their search box, and you'll be right where you need to be to make easy, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Once again, thanks so much for your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Plenty still going on here, but we're caught up in the metaphysical world. And we ought to continue, because I did mean to get past this Newsweek article, but it's a great launching pad for a lot of this discussion because there are contrasting views, and they keep them relatively simple and short, so it's easy to jump back and forth between them. Let's see, we just left off with Carlton Larson's rather conservative ish view of it, but that ends up perhaps maybe it's more liberal than we think, giving lots of leeway to the likes of, let's say, Obama's of the world in their quest to let's say change the direction of American foreign policy and take a temporary hit in order to advance the long-term interests of the United States. As so far, I don't see any long-term vision coming out of Donald Trump, but maybe we just misunderstand it all. And this is giving him the huge benefit of the doubt. And I still do think he's far too dumb to have such a long-term vision of anything. And I really think that his only vision is how he can get a hold of more money for himself. And there's different cover stories you can concoct for things, and if he were smart enough, he would have concocted these stories, and we wouldn't be so convinced that it was obviously only about money for him. He's just not smart enough or savvy enough to do such a thing, and it's just evidence that it probably never even entered his mind. But where we left off with this was let's see, according to Larson, enemies are defined very precisely under American treason law, and I guess for whatever reason he goes back after making such an interesting statement and hangs his hat on the Declaration of War explanation for who is an enemy. I don't think that's necessary. An enemy is a nation or an organization with which the United States is in a declared or open war, Larson wrote, or open. So in other words, if you ask him about Al-Qaeda or ISIS, he would say, well, that's an open war, even if it's not a declared one, because he says so. And he needs us to be able to be at war with ISIS in order to justify our actions wherever. So that's the construct he's given it himself. It's not particularly sound once it's examined, but neither are any of these things. I don't see how you can construct sound principles in a in a system in which, like we've said a number of times, that 5 people can decide one day it's no longer operative, and then if they like it, go back and decide it is operative again. And that's not going to produce consistent results all the time. But in the main, if you can stick to some norms and say we ought not to allow ourselves to simply reverse ourselves on a dime, then you can construct something that looks a little bit more stable than what we actually have. Nations with whom we are formally at peace, such as Russia, are not enemies, Larson said. Indeed, a treason prosecution naming Russia as an enemy would be tantamount to a declaration of war. Interesting thought. And what do we make of calling the European Union a foe? Is that a declaration of war, or do we have to prosecute someone for treason for cooperating with the European Union in order to turn it into a declaration of war? Unclear, because it's off-the-cuff stuff from Larson. And we have no basis for deciding. Russia is a strategic adversary whose interests are frequently at odds with those of the United States, but for purposes of treason law, it is no different than Canada or France or even the American Red Cross. I am not certain that that is the case either, and I do think, for instance, you could be charged. Well, I don't know. I guess they never charged, let's say, Jonathan Pollard with treason. They charged him with espionage for giving, and I guess that's the difference, giving away secrets to Israel, an ally with whom there's no definition we could lean on to get a significant number of people to agree we're at war with them. I guess there's that. But I mean, I guess again, if we were talking about earlier in the show, if you get away with it, then it isn't illegal. If you're pardoned or if it's waived off by some portion of officialdom, then it's not, effectively illegal. Is there really an effective difference between espionage and treason? If you can end up in jail for just as long with both of them, it's just a matter of who you gave the secrets to. You weren't supposed to give the secrets to anybody. You gave them to Party A, espionage, 10 years in prison. Give them to Party B, espionage, 10 years in prison. Give them to Party C, treason, 10 years in prison. What's the difference? I suppose the treason part of it, the different word, aggravating factor, 50 years in prison, or death, or $10,001 fine. Anyway, let's wind up the Newsweek thing. Russia, strategic adversary, yada, yada. Frequently at odds with the United States, but for purposes of treason law, it's no different than Canada or France or even the American Red Cross. The details of the alleged connections between Russia and Trump officials are therefore irrelevant to treason law. The White House did not immediately respond to a request for comment, and likely never will. So, an interesting start. There were more articles. I did tell you that. And we'll deal with the slow laptop and overheating laptop. I think you can hear, if you're really careful, you can hear the whining of the fan in the background. Let's take a look at some of the other items in Pocket. There are more academic articles out there. And let's see. Where's the, what do we want to grab here? There was at least one other article out there that I thought I would share with you. The other extreme of things from the Newsweek General Sampler would be this piece at the Lawfare blog, if I can get it to open up correctly. Uncomfortable questions in the wake of the Russia Indictment 2.0 and Trump's press conference with Putin. This by Jack Goldsmith, written yesterday at 5:26, by which time I think the Butina arrest been announced? I don't know if that necessarily changes things. Let's see what Jack Goldsmith has to say. Keeping in mind that Jack Goldsmith, again, though he's been very helpful in many ways, is essentially an extraordinarily conservative guy and takes a very conservative approach to questions that I think puts him on the wrong side of a lot of issues of executive power. But he takes a very interesting approach to this one. And I think in many ways it's hard for me even to, in this context to be terribly critical, because I think his conservative approach and my, I guess, maybe liberal approach have brought us to the same territory. I don't know if he would consider himself being just a legal realist and whether he would ever agree, well, the law is what 5 justices say at any given time, and that's kind of the way it is. That's the truth of it. I don't know whether he would agree with that or not. But anyway, keeping in mind that he's a pretty conservative person and that you should take this with an additional grain of salt because this was an article that actually was highly recommended by Glenn Greenwald, and that makes a lot of people uncomfortable and all by itself. But it, whatever. Don't worry about it. It shouldn't. I think some good points made here, and I think we've given enough context of where I think we are in all of this that we can safely read through this. Special Counsel Robert Mueller and his Justice Department / FBI team deserve congratulations for doing their job of figuring out in concrete detail what the Russians did in the 2016 election campaign and telling the American people about it. Now an indictment, and perhaps later and in more detail in a report. Last week's indictment might also portend, as the lawfare crew implied in a linked article here, a tightening of the criminal conspiracy noose to include Americans, perhaps some with connections to the Trump campaign. And indeed, it certainly seems to be the case. The indictment also represents an extraordinary assertion of Justice Department power and independence. That's where things get a little technical. President Trump never stops complaining about the DOJ witch hunt, but his subordinates in the Potemkin Unitary Executive Branch, interesting term, keep proving him wrong. The president didn't even have the de facto authority to delay Rod Rosenstein's announcement from the maximum embarrassment it caused him on the dawn of his summit, which I dispute the terminology, with Vladimir Putin. With each new concrete revelation contrary to the president's wishes and representations, Rosenstein's and Mueller's effective power grows vis-a-vis the president. But behind the indictment and the congratulatory reaction to it lie some uncomfortable, unanswered questions about blowback toward U.S. officials, reciprocal interference by the United States in other nations' political affairs, the lack of preparation for renewed electoral interference in this country, and U.S. journalists' publication of stolen U.S. government information. These questions have heightened significance and more difficult answers in light of President Trump's astounding performance Monday in Helsinki. First, the blowback. Jack writes here, I have been critical of the Justice Department's indict and shame strategy in the past, and even liberals can understand why that might be the case. And I noted the downsides of Mueller's first indictment. Here again in a linked article. I agree that indictments can serve useful goals, as David Chris noted in the best account of law enforcement as a counterintelligence tool, also linked. And Mueller's speaking indictment certainly serves the very important goal of telling the American people what happened in 2016. I continue to think, however, that as a substitute for other responses to serious cyber intrusions, indictments, on balance, signal weakness. What I want to focus on here is how this highest profile yet indictment of foreign officials for breaking into computers in the United States raises questions about reciprocity and blowback. And this is the part which I guess interested Glenn Greenwald in the article. And he's not wrong. But of course it's not the whole story. And it should be noted here that Goldsmith acknowledges the implications of whataboutism in this and asserts that it's not his intention. So at least that's out there. I won't make you wait for it. So as he wrote, I wanted to focus on how this highest profile yet indictment of foreign officials for breaking into computers in the United States raises questions about reciprocity and blowback. As the Snowden documents and David Sanger's great new book and other books make plain, and as U.S. officials are wont to brag, the U.S. intelligence services break into computers and computer networks abroad at an astounding rate, certainly on a greater scale than any other intelligence service in the world. Well, it's not entirely certain, but it's certainly likely. Every one of these intrusions in another country violates that country's criminal laws prohibiting unauthorized computer access and damage, no less than Russian violations of U.S. laws outlined in Mueller's indictments. This is not a claim about the relative moral merits of the two countries' cyber intrusions. It is simply a claim that each side unequivocally breaks the laws of the other in its cyber espionage activities. How will the United States respond when Russia and China and Iran start naming and indicting U.S. officials. Maybe the United States thinks its concealment techniques are so good that the type of detailed attribution it made against the Russians is infeasible. And here he notes something that we haven't yet read from Marcy Wheeler, who will help clarify who are these guys. The shadow brokers, or this guy, for all I know. It's difficult to tell. The shadow brokers revealed the identities, for instance, of specific NSA operators. So even if the National Security Agency is great at concealment as a matter of tradecraft, that is no protection against an insider threat. And that's always true. But what an interesting question. Like, what do we do? We're meant to fret over the question of what do we do if Russia and China and Iran start naming and indicting U.S. officials? And the answer is you say, oh no, that's terrible. And just as Russia is not going to give us those officials, we would not give them those Americans. We'd say, oh my goodness, that's horrible. And we might even be able to consistently say, yes, good, we should not be doing that. And people should not be doing it to us. They are, and we are, but we shouldn't be. Of course, if you really wanted to get fantastical about it, under what circumstances would we not be doing that to one another? Under Star Trek-style world government, when we're all at peace and in a giant political union, and it wouldn't make any particular sense to be breaking into one another's computers. Oh, my God. Well, anyway, let's not credit Donald Trump with anything so far-reaching as that. Maybe Russia and China and Iran won't bother indicting U.S. officials unless and until the indictments actually materialize into a trial, which they likely never will. But I guess if they happen upon such a person walking around in Bangladesh and grabbed him off the streets and rendered him to Russia or China or Iran, then they might indict him because they're in their hands now, I guess is what he's arguing. But what is the answer in principle? We're supposed to care about something, right, in principle. And what is the U.S. policy, if any, that is being communicated to military and civilian operators who face this threat? In other words, if we're going to start indicting their people and at the same time order our people to surreptitiously be breaking into the computers of those countries, what are we telling them by indicting their operators about their liabilities if the Russians or Chinese or Iranians get mad at them and can finally figure out who they are by name and indict them? Will we defend them and be hypocrites, or will we hand them over and be consistent? And will they do our bidding? Will they do the work we assign to them to keep us safe and free if the prospect of indictments are out there hanging over their heads? What is the U.S. government response to former NSA official Jake Williams, who worked in tailored access operations and who presumably spoke for many others at NSA when he said that charging military or government hackers is dumb and will eventually hurt the U.S.? It's an interesting question. The second part of our article here, interference and reciprocity. The Mueller indictment was greeted by outrage anew, outrage that is reaching new heights after President Trump's Russia-friendly press conference. But is there a principled basis on which the United States can object to the Russian interference? Yes, self-determination for everybody, even though, yeah, that's the problem. We don't really allow a lot of that these days elsewhere. Although sometimes we interfere in the name of self-determination. How odd is that? Let Jack make the argument here. Recall that President Obama boasted that U.S. offensive cyber capacities were the greatest in the world. Sanger reports that the United States remains the world's stealthiest, most skillful cyber power. Then consider the wide array of U.S. cyber intrusions abroad revealed by Snowden. Olympic Games, the operation against Iranian centrifuges that Michael Hayden compared in significance to the use of nuclear weapons in August of 1945. Consider the shadow broker leaks of many of the NSA's offensive tools and what the NSA was doing with those tools. Consider the U.S. Internet Freedom Program, which, among other things, provides cyber tools and training to activists in authoritarian nations with the aim of achieving political change there. or interfering in the name of self-determination. See? U.S. officials assisting and urging U.S. social media giants such as Twitter to help activists bring down foreign governments. Bad ones. Right? This is but a bit of the public evidence, surely a tiny sliver of the overall evidence of U.S. interferences abroad using offensive cyber tools of various sorts. These interferences are why the United States, along with Russia, is widely viewed as one of the world's most dangerous cyber bullies, if not the most dangerous. And not just by authoritarian states. The U.S. interferences don't, in any moral sense, justify what Russia did in 2016, though they might have, as Sanger and I, Jack Goldsmith, and others have suggested, invited or encouraged them. Nor do U.S. cyber interferences abroad in any way impact Mueller's work, which is to find out what Russia did, so the United States can hold the relevant actors responsible to the extent possible and hopefully do better the next time. But I guess essentially what he's asking here is this question any different from the consideration among some, maybe a lot of people, post 9/11? Like, well, of course they did this to us. We've been oppressing Name Your Poison in Name Your Poisonous Country for years now. Of course, this burgeoning anger was going to explode at some point and be visited upon us. And that was not an illegitimate pursuit, although it wasn't very popular at the time, but, it was a difficult time. Anyway, that's what I'm comparing it to. But U.S. interferences abroad do raise the question, he continues, what is the U.S. objection in principle if others do to us as we do to them? The Mueller indictment at bottom accuses the named Russians of hacking into our computers in the United States, stealing information, and using that information in public to Russia's advantage. Similarly, the United States uses the masses of digital information it steals to its advantage in every element of its international relations, including to influence foreign political outcomes. But they're bad people. That's all we have to hang our hat on. It is no response to say that the United States doesn't meddle in foreign elections, because it has in the past. And again, here, Glenn Greenwald, very excited. At least as recently as Bill Clinton's intervention in the Russian presidential election of 1996, and possibly as recently as the Hillary Clinton State Department's alleged intervention in Russia's 2011 legislative elections. And during the Cold War, the United States intervened in numerous foreign elections, more than twice as often as the Soviet Union. And that's a linked claim. You can check it out for yourself. Intelligence history expert Locke Johnson told Scott Shane that the 2016 Russia electoral interference is the cyber age version of standard United States practice for decades, whenever American officials were worried about a foreign vote. The CIA's former chief of Russia operations, Stephen L. Hall, told Shane, if you ask an intelligence officer, did the Russians break the rules or do something bizarre? The answer is no, not at all. Hall added that the United States absolutely has carried out such election influence operations historically, and I hope we keep doing it. I guess the big difference here is, did Russia do something bizarre in that they managed to find a major party candidate who was actually close enough to being electable, I guess, that they could get collusion and cooperation from the inside on the same operation? There, I think, we're looking at something new and unusual. But I'm sure it was always hoped for. Certainly it was the overt plan in the CIA when it comes to advocating among activists for regime change. The whole idea was to get somebody on the inside. Johnson and Hall argued to Shane that Russian and American interferences in elections have not been morally equivalent, since American interventions have generally been aimed at helping non-authoritarian candidates challenge dictators or otherwise promoting democracy, while Russia has more often intervened to disrupt democracy or promote authoritarian rule. This is descriptively true in general, and I'll bet there are a lot of you out there who would say, wait a minute, I don't even know if I agree with that, though it helps. This is descriptively true in general, but not always. Comforting to Americans and perhaps of moral relevance, but it won't influence Putin or other adversaries, and that's certainly true. And it cuts no ice in international relations generally. Nor is there any relevant distinction in international law. International law almost certainly does not regulate cyber theft, and certainly not in a way that distinguishes what other nations increasingly do to us via cyber theft from what we do to them via cyber theft. It definitely doesn't distinguish between interferences in foreign nations and their elections to promote democracy and similar interferences that seek to disrupt democracy. Nor does it pick out doxing for particular disapprobation. We can draw distinctions between what the Russians do and what we do from a moral and motivational perspective, and maybe in some factual details, but these differences don't matter to our adversaries under any shared normative framework, which I guess you could borrow later on to say, political union with the Russians because shared normative framework? No, there is no such thing. You're wrong. What you're doing is out of bounds. Oh. Damn. He continues, though, these are not intended as gotcha or whataboutism points. I told you he was going to say that. I had already read this part. Americans are right to be shocked and angry by the revelations in the Mueller indictment, and the government must do everything in its power to ensure that American voters choose leaders without foreign interference. The question is what the United States should do about the unacceptable operations in 2016, and so far it hasn't done much. As I have long argued, he says, I think the United States' failure to look in the mirror is a large part of the problem. Oh my God, could Trump have a point? We don't want to acknowledge that. But this is a difficult and painful thing to say the same day the President of the United States stood next to Putin, discredited U.S. intelligence agencies, and said, we're all to blame for the poor state of U.S.-Russia relations. I am certainly not blaming U.S. intelligence agencies, which don't control U.S. strategic decisions, for anything. But the reality is that the United States government engages in substantially similar behavior to that which the Russians used to cause us great harm. This reality has strategic implications for, among other things, the ability to develop bilateral or multilateral international norms as a constraint on the forms of interference in that the United States abhors. But we are not talking about this reality in the United States. Maybe it's myopia. Maybe it's fear of charges of moral equivalency, but we're not talking about it. If as a nation we want to take seriously the threat before us, we should ask whether and how our own actions sparked or invited what we now face and what that implies for our efforts to redress these interferences. I do express some doubt, I am not positive, but I will express some doubt at this point, whether or not Jack Goldsmith would have accepted this very same argument with respect to terrorism post 9/11. I doubt it, given his record. To understand this predicament and to have a strategic conversation with allies and adversaries alike, we need an honest, pragmatic assessment of our own conduct that doesn't fall back on, it's okay when we do it, justifications. Such assertions, however right as a moral matter, won't change the behavior of adversaries or improve the U.S. position, and might be a hurdle to both. Being honest with ourselves is especially important in a world where our adversaries accurately view cyber tools as a relatively inexpensive and hugely effective way to achieve advantage over the United States. I have offered some thoughts, and he has some links, on how self-candor might lead to progress. Here's another suggestion. The U.S. government has not, to the best of my knowledge, formally or informally, claimed that Russia's 2016 behavior violates international law. Nor, I believe, has it even strongly been claimed that infringes on sovereignty of the type the Russians engaged in is unacceptable in international relations. I think I mangled that sentence, but I hope you get the idea, as we are nearly out of time. To have any chance of establishing a norm against the operation outlined in Mueller's indictment, and I am not confident that this is possible, the United States needs to draw a strong, principled line and defend it. That defense would acknowledge that the United States has interfered in elections itself, renounce those actions, and pledge not to do them again. Acknowledge that it continues to engage in forms of computer network exploitations for various purposes that it deems legitimate, and state precisely the norm that the United States pledges to stand by and that the Russians violated. Would it work? I don't know. It is revealing that the United States has done none of these things, and it is unclear whether it can do them, but this is a necessary first step to creating norms to prohibit what happened in 2016. Now, assuming these proposals make sense, it is hard to see how the Trump administration can even begin to implement them. Far from standing up to Putin and wanting to draw a line, Trump shows every sign of accommodating Putin. The president is also in the amazing position of not being credible to his own intelligence agencies about his bona fides when it comes to the Russians. Even if this president were persuaded to push an international norm against what happened in 2016, any proposals along the lines suggested above would likely be pilloried as caving to the Russians or engaging in moral equivalency, or, I would say, trying to set up a Star Trek-style world government. I also fear that Trump's performance Monday will heighten the angry concern that Americans and members of Congress feel about what happened in 2016, and that it will make it yet harder to look in the mirror. Now, Part 3, we remain vulnerable, and Part 4, implications for the press, still hanging out there. We don't have time to get to them today. I recommend that you take a look, but I think we got the gist of what we needed to keep asking the same questions and keep pondering things in different light. And unfortunately, some of these things occasionally will lead you to the conclusion, maybe Trump has a point. I can't imagine that he has it in his own head, though. I think he accidentally stumbles upon them, and we should be careful about legitimizing things after the fact. I don't think I have to warn you about that. You'll know when it's dangerous.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Now, my laptop computer is responding too slowly for me to bring you the pre-prepared remarks about what you can expect on the upcoming West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy featuring Justice Putnam, but I can assure you that it is a wider look at the broader range of news stories abroad and at home than we offered today.